Okay, you guys, let's jump into a quantitative study. So over here is the evidence table that is from your book, okay? So our goal is to go through each one of these categories with this article I pulled from somebody's assignment. So the first, I typed all this in beforehand because I'm the worst typist ever, so to save some time. So the first column is about the author's date of publication and title, and all I do is cut and paste this stuff. So you see I have the three authors, their last name, the year of publication, this is the title of the journal, and then this is the title of the article. Pretty easy. As you read through this article, so I read this article, and I think actually reading articles is kind of fun when I know I have a purpose here to fill in this table. As I read through this article just really quick, oftentimes they'll have the introduction, and many research articles will have a section for their conceptual framework. This one does not. So you just write no conceptual or theoretical framework reported. Doesn't mean they didn't do it, it just means they didn't report it. Okay, so our next is a design method and a study type, what was done and what was done in the study. So you always start out reading the abstract, and the abstract really does give you actually a lot of information, but it doesn't give you all the information you need. I just highlighted some important things things that were important to me. I know that they're talking about school-based interventions, and they did an obesity intervention at a low-income school, and they found their evidence of weight status change. So I know that that's where they're looking at. Their target population right here was 4,000, but further on down the line, we'll find that their actual sample size was N 2,259. It gives us a little bit of report of the data analysis, so we have an idea. It's a longitudinal descriptive inferential right there in the paired t-test, and chi-squares tells us this is a quantitative study. We're talking numbers here, and actually it goes on to tell us about the statistical results, okay, which we'll go over in a minute. So as we cruise through this thing, we read the introduction. Introductions are important to read because they really ground you about the study, and they do give you some important information, such as this study went on between 2007 and 2010. And we know it was about an education program right here to implement changes to a physical education equipment and curriculum. So we know that was pretty much the purpose here about this study, was having an intervention within this low-income school. And we were looking at BMI and weight, as it discussed here in this abstract. What I really like here is they had to get IRB approval. That tells you right now it was an intervention and it was a research study. The last sentence in this is really kind of nice. It kind of sums it up pretty nicely. This paper presents the results of a longitudinal analysis among those who have at least a baseline and endpoint height and weight measurement, and this was our sample size. Okay, so if we want to talk about If we want to talk about our design method, study type, and what was done, we know it's a quantitative study, and it's a 3-year longitudinal cohort study from the fall of 2007 to 2010. So that's really important to get in there, okay? We know that the study type, that was the study type. We know what was done was that they examined, and it was up here, they talked about it, they examined, and it's down here as well, their intervention, if we kept reading through here. They examined height, weight, and BMI post a school-based obesity intervention program, which was an educational program about physical education equipment and curriculum. Okay, so if we go over here to this next column, we look at the sample and the sample setting. The goal is to be brief here, just so you know when you go back, you have organized data and you know right off the bat what it was you read about this article that was important. So the sample, we know that there were 4,000 targeted students, but the N ended up being only 2,259. And it was those children that were meant that actually, the reason the sample was this number instead of this number was because this number was those children who actually had baseline and endpoint measurements, okay? So I guess the rest of these kids didn't. And it talks about that in the study a little bit, okay? We also need to talk about characteristics of the population and setting. So the setting was in a low-income school in New York, talked about that, and characteristics of the, of the sample, there's a section for sample, was that these were children or students from grades 3 through 12. they actually broke it down into percentages. If you read through it, and I have it written right here, they talk a little bit more, female versus male, and 89% were non-Hispanic white. Some people say, oh, well, this may be a bias because it's only this population. But what's important, and the study mentions this, is this actually represents the population of the school. So there really are no outliers. What you see is what you get, okay? So now we want to talk about major variables and their definitions. Okay, so we went to the intervention and we talked about that. They were doing a physical education program, okay? That was the independent variable, because they wanted to conduct this intervention right here to see what the impact or the outcome would be on weight and BMI, okay? So the independent variable is the education program, and the dependent variable is weight and BMI. I noticed that they do talk about height, obviously, and that was a measurement they had to obtain, but it's not really a dependent variable because you have to get the height and weight to be able to measure the BMI, okay? So we can skip right on to here to the measurement of the major variables. We know that height, and it talks about this here. Hang on. It gives us a nice little section on measures. Not all articles obviously are like this. Sometimes you really have to dig. But it talks about how the height and date were collected once per semester for 6 semesters, and that's probably something that you could write in here. I didn't do it. The height was measured using a calibrated stadiometer, not sure how to pronounce that, to the nearest 1/4 inch, and the weight was measured with a calibrated digital scale to the nearest 1/10 of a pound. So that comes right here from this article. So that's important. These are your measurements. This is how they're measuring those outcome or dependent variables, okay? Now, we're supposed to talk about the author and the name of a scale. Well, there is no author to the height and weight. And the reliability of these scales, it's been around forever, and they calibrated it, so you're not going to even talk about a Cronbach's alpha here, okay? So now, we need to move on to data analysis. All they're asking here, when we talk about quantitative, is what were the results, what were the statistics used? And we saw already in the abstract up here that it was the paired samples t-test and chi-squared. Some articles or some research studies, depending on what they're looking for, go on and on with statistics. But what you really need to do is pull out the primary ones, the ones that you think are the most important, and the ones you pull out, actually you have to match, and we'll talk about that, to the study findings, okay? So the statistical test was mentioned up here, but when you move down here, this is where you're really going to want to look, is in analysis and results, okay? So we know SPSS was used, so I write that in there. That was the program used to look at all the data. We know that right here, paired samples t-test compared the BMI, percentile means. And so I just write paired samples t-test. And I saw down here, and I know above in the abstract, they use chi-squared test, period. That's all. 2 statistical tests, no big deal. That's what I write down, okay? So I can move over a little, and I want to talk about study findings. So here's what I'm talking about. Your findings need to match your variables. So I have these 2 variables, an independent, which is the educational program, and I actually have 2 dependent variables. One is weight and one is BMI. So when I talk about study findings over here, they need to match these variables. So what we saw here was improvement with weight status post the education program. Okay, so we're talking about the IV here, and we are talking about the DV of weight, okay? We see that we have the paired t-test showed statistically significant. It's important to use that word statistically significant in there because there is a statistical significance and there's a clinical significance. You're looking at statistical in this column, but over here you're truly looking at clinical significance, okay? So the paired t-test showed statistically significant decrease in the BMI. So I'm talking about my dependent variable there from the post the intervention, the education plan. And the p-value was less than 0.001, and I know you know what that is from your research course. Your article has a 0 right here. With APA, do not put a 0. It's just 0.00 whatever, okay? There's no 0 before the decimal. Okay, so our next results were the chi-squared showed statistically significant decrease in weight after the educational program. The p-value was less than 0.001. And it also showed it paired t-test. I think I already wrote that up there. Yes. Oh, this was a paired t-test about BMI, showed statistical. Well, I think I already have that right there. Oops. So there you go. I actually did that twice. Don't need to do that. Boom. Okay. So anyway, see, I covered all my variables with my study findings. All right, so here's where we want to look at appraisal, worth to practice, the strength and the limitations of the study. Risk, harm, was there any to the students? No, and by the way, they did get IRB approval, and that's probably a good thing to write in there. IRB approval was obtained, okay? In QI, and I'll mention that later, you don't have to, generally, QI projects, quality improvement projects, you don't have to get IRB or ethics committee approval, but you should always run it through the committee just in case. But that's a big difference between QI and actual research, okay? So here we go. Oh, the other thing we're going to look at is the feasibility for practice. So this is really about your clinical significance, and really importantly, you need to look at your level of evidence. And you can use this site that was in your book in that table on page 552, or you can use the AACN pyramid, which I talked about, and I personally like that one. And I think it's a good one for everybody to use, honestly. You'll see it out there in the literature. Okay, so if you scroll down here and you keep reading, this is where the statistical results were found. The discussion is really important. I'm going to tell you, as a researcher, this is probably the hardest thing to write, is the discussion. I know it's only 2 paragraphs, but it's not easy, okay? It's really important. That gives you, it really ties things together. So this talks about your limitations. This, a limitation is they did their educational plan, and they did curriculum changes, they did equipment changes. When you read your article, you'll see that. So one of the limitations is they really weren't able to measure which aspect of the intervention, the education program, really made the difference. Was it a certain motivational strategy? Was it the equipment? Was it the change in curriculum? Who knows? They did notice a difference, though, so that's important. This doesn't mean, limitations of a study never mean anything bad. They have to be addressed because every single study has limitations. No study is perfect. The other thing was there was no control group here, okay? And that's always a limitation. Not a big deal, though. They just mention it. Sometimes control groups aren't something we really want, okay? I mentioned this already. So clinical significance. So this study does suggest that consistent school-based interventions can be beneficial to reduce weight and height. So I think that's pretty important. They showed that with their statistical significance, okay? And is it feasible? Is it worth it? What do you think? I think it sounds pretty good. I think it'd be interesting to try. Maybe sometimes some people couldn't put all aspects into a study, but what they could do is put a couple in there and then measure those specifically to see which aspect of the education program made a difference. So all in all, I think this is a good study, and it does have statistical significance and clinical significance. Now, the important thing is, let's talk about that level of evidence. So the AACN, if you go back to that, it's actually a level C, and if you use this, it's a level C as well. And I can't remember what a level C means because I can't remember, but that's what I came up with. These certainly aren't the same thing. These are apples to oranges. These are apples to oranges, but I just wanted to show you that I did use both of them. Okay, so we're going to stop with the quantitative, and the next video will be on qual.